and by the Montana Farmers Union, a grassroots organization working for family farmers, ranchers, and rural communities. Online at montanafarmersunion.com. And by the Montana Nursery and Landscape Association, a trade association of horticulture professionals who can assist with yard, gardening, and outdoor space questions. Members in your area can be found at plantingmontana.com. Montana Ag Live is made possible by the Montana Department of Agriculture, the MSU Extension Service, the MSU Ag Experiment Stations of the College of Agriculture, the Montana Wheat and Barley Committee, Cashman Nursery and Landscaping, the Northern Pulse Growers Association, and the Gallatin Gardeners Club.
If you haven't guessed it, you are tuned to Montana Ag Live, originating today from the studios of KUSM on the very outstanding campus we call Montana State University, and coming to you over your Montana Public Television system. It's been a good week here in Bozeman for agriculture. We had the Celebrate Agriculture event here on campus. It's always interesting to see a lot of good old friends there. And to top it off, there was an excellent football game here yesterday, and the Bobcats got it done again. So congratulations to them. Tonight we're going to have a really kind of interesting, different type of program. We're going to look at a topic that we call coal seam fires. And they are big. They threaten the sustainability of the grasslands out in the eastern part of Montana. We call that the Powder River Basin, also northern Wyoming. And we have a guest that's here from that part of the country tonight. But before we get to that, let me introduce the panel this evening. On my far left, Sam Weifel. Sam is a range scientist here in the Animal Science Department, relatively new here in Montana. We're happy to have him on the program. And Sam, thanks for coming in tonight. We'll have a good time. Special guest, all the way from Miles City, Cory Cheguis. Cory is a fire warden out in the Powder River Basin, and he is one of the most knowledgeable individuals when it comes to coal seam fires. We're going to learn a lot about them, why they occur, and how much damage they're doing. Jane Mangold, I'm going to call you an invasive specialist tonight, not a weed scientist. So Jane's here quite often. Jane, thanks for coming in, and of course, Abby. But before we go, I want to introduce the phone operators. We have Cheryl Bennett and John Hawley. If you have questions tonight, and definitely I'm sure we're going to have plenty about coal seam fires, call them in and we'll do our best to get them on this evening. I've always said my favorite city in northeast or north central Montana is Fort Benton. My favorite city in the eastern part of the state is Miles City. A good weekend for those people that want to spend a little time in Montana. Go up to Fort Benton, see the history there, stay at the Grand Union, head to Miles City the next day, stop at the Range Rider Bar and have a beer or two. It's a great area to really visit. I am a big promoter of eastern Montana. Cory, thank you for coming in. Tell us about coal seam fires and what you do out there in Miles City in the Powder River Basin.
Well, thanks, Jack, for having me. Coal seam fires have created quite a burden on local agriculture in eastern Montana. In 2011, it was a really wet year, had a good fuel growth, and then 2012 was a drought year. There's always been a few coal seams around eastern Montana, but after that, 2012 had a bunch of wildland fires, and then after that it seemed to be more and more active wildland fires caused from coal seams. But what honestly happened was after that drought year that caused all the wildland fires, all these burning coal seams ignited across eastern Montana. And every time we have a new wildfire, another one, a whole bunch more starts within the Powder River Basin.
So just an estimate. I know there's people mapping, and we'll get into that a little bit, but your guess, how many coal seam fires are actually present in that area? And I think the number is going to shock me.
Yeah, Jack, I'm thinking probably 2,000. We've already got 700 mapped right now, verified boots on the ground, went to each of these sites. So I would definitely say roughly around 2,000, maybe even 2,500. It's so hard to tell at this time.
They've caused some huge fires out in that area. I think we were talking ahead of time. What did you say in Rosebud County? How many acres burned associated with coal seam fires?
So actually, whole eastern Montana, last year, for example, there's 13 counties in eastern Montana, in the ELO is what we call it, Eastern Land Office. We burned a total of 248,000 acres. That's total for everything. 201,000 acres were specifically attributed to coal seam fires.
That's amazing. So I want to ask you one more question, and I've got one that came in here for Sam. How do you put one of these coal seam fires out?
Good question. We've been working, my friends in Powder River County, we've been trying to test some data, do a little scientific work on the side to figure out what we can do. Those guys have actually excavated one, which will be very costly. Every coal seam's different. There's small ones, big ones, surface coal seams. There's some in the middle of draws that you can't get to them at miles in the back hills. So I think we could get to maybe a management standpoint, but I don't physically think mitigating all of them by digging them up is feasible.
You know, I've talked to a couple ranchers out in that area, and I spend some time out there, mainly hunting, because I'm not in the range area, but I know they lose a lot of rangeland. And Sam, I had a question that came in via Facebook ahead of time. What is the philosophy of grazing after a wildfire?
Thanks, and that's a good question, and I guess real quick before I get to that, I do have a background in range, but I'm actually the extension beef specialist here on campus, and so I do a lot of work with grazing on rangelands and things like that, but I should just point that out if folks want to get in contact with me. My specialty is actually beef production on grazing rangelands, but no, that is a really interesting component, and right now it's a fairly conservative approach, and the philosophy is like once there's a wildfire on a rangeland, the federal BLM and Forest Service, their typical management strategy is I would say probably a minimum of 2 years of rest. I'm sure there's some wiggle room on that, and the whole thought between that is that the wildfire comes through and essentially defoliates and kind of maybe puts these plants at a level of stress. And so by giving those plants a full years of rest allows them to kind of recover, and then that second year allows them to potentially like set seed, re-inoculate the seed bank, and before we start putting grazing pressure back on those plants. Some of the research I've seen that looks at some of those philosophies, you know, the effects of rangeland or the effects of wildfire on rangeland, it really depends on the ecosystem, precipitation ranges, soil conditions, and recently I've seen some work that looked at what the vegetation community looked like prior to fire and how healthy that system was, has a big impact on how that rebounds after fire as well.
Okay, thank you. Changing tune a little bit, Corvallis caller, this is for Abby, and this is kind of interesting. They have a bunch of crab trees, and they have way too many crab apples, and they don't like that because they attract deer, and the deer are grazing on their tulips in the spring, and so forth and so on. How can they prevent production of the apples on a crabapple tree?
That is a good question. I don't know how easy it would be to do that. Yeah, I don't know. I think
there used to be a product, and well, it's still around, called Sevin. It's an insecticide that does abort blossoms. The problem with that is bees. Yeah, you're going to do damage to bees.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, pollinators are really attracted to crabapple trees, but yeah, I'd say that would be a challenging thing to take care of.
Okay, thank you.
I have a follow-up question. Are there varieties of crabapple that don't produce apples? Like you still get the beautiful flowers in the spring, but
Yeah.
maybe they don't produce apples, or they're really small?
Yeah, there
apples?
are more ornamental varieties of flowering crabapples and other flowering fruit trees that you could look into. That would probably be a good option for someone who wants a really nice flowering tree for bees but doesn't want to deal with the fruit.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. From Malta, Cory, this person would like to know, how do the coal seam fires actually ignite grass fires? Because they've heard that the coal seam fires are deep in the ground, whereas the grass is closer to the surface. So in other words, why or how deep do these fires actually burn?
Good question. Every coal seam is actually different. So, for example, I was actually out Thursday this week with some people from the other side of the state, showing them how this happens. Every coal seam, they could burn underground very deep, or they're actually burning on top. These pockets of coal are anywhere from 2 inches thick, just as an example, to 20 feet thick. And so they'll burn underground, and when the ground creates a void with that burning pocket of coal, and the ground sloughs off, opens it up. And so then you got this exposed pocket of coal, or they're coming out the vents. Some of these vents are 900,000 degrees from the burning coal coming out. So that actually, on a hot, dry day, essentially is the grass will slough off, that bank will slough, as you see in some of these pictures. And if you look at that one right there on the screen, that's an exposed seam where it's exposed at, and it catches the grass on fire.
I have a follow-up question. How long do these coal seam fires burn?
There's actually been some talking to locals, grandpa's grandpa, that hundreds of years, some of them. But we found some that have started since 2012, that bad fire year, that have actually went out on their own.
Okay. There's a rancher out there, you know him, I've talked to him on the phone many times. His name is Scott McRae. He's north of Cheyenne Reservation down there. And they had a big rangeland fire. It consumed 15 to 20,000 acres several years ago. Since then, he claims that every year he has fires that ignite from the coal seam fires, and that has really reduced his carrying capacity. Any comments on that?
Yeah, actually, I know the McRae's really well, and they're part of the reason why I even started this project was we got to start looking towards a solution. Mr. McRae and their family, I go to fires there all the time on their place, ironically, and have been over the years. This year, I think they've had 3 or 4. I'm not positive, but last year was Richard Springs fire, burned 170,000 acres, and it completely wiped out the McRae place, burned them out. And it has actually started more new coal seams that were never known about before.
What is how does a rancher handle a situation where their winter forage is burnt, they don't have the alfalfa, so forth? How do they handle that nowadays?
Yeah, and I think that's actually a great question, and probably a great question to some of these producers that have had to deal with it. I think, there's always the thought of having a stockpile of hay put up or something is an emergency forage source, things like that. But usually when these things happen and it's unpredictable, the options is to find grazing somewhere else, lease other ground, purchase. You hear a lot of people that are having to purchase forages or purchase hay in order to feed those animals during those times. And a worst case scenario, there's always the option of reducing herd size to match what forage availability you have at that moment. But yeah, I don't think there's a magic solution there. It's, the cows have got to eat, and so you just got to find places to graze or some forages to supply.
Yeah, I'm sure there's, and I'm not familiar with, I'm sure there's probably some government programs that are designed to assist disaster payments for helping these ranchers along. Cory, have you ran into any of that in your?
So there actually is through Montana Disaster Emergency Services. I believe there is some sort of help for, not really through emergency services, but small business. But And USDA, I believe, does have a program that will assist when you're burned out.
Okay, it's becoming more commonplace.
It really is. And you look at, I don't know what insurance companies are doing about this specifically. That's an unknown.
Yeah, something to be considered. From Miles City, what weeds come in after these fires threaten the rangeland? And Jane, you can jump in on that.
Yeah, well, I'll take a shot, but then I'd like to hear what Cory's experience is firsthand. But my guess would be if there's cheatgrass in the area prior to the fire, cheatgrass would be, and maybe Japanese brome in that part of the state would be two species that would show up. Canada thistle probably, if Canada thistle is around. One of people often ask, like, does fire encourage weeds? And it kind of depends on what weeds are there before the fire. If there aren't weeds there before the fire, you're probably not going to have as much of a weed problem after, unless some weeds would come in on equipment, firefighting equipment.
You disturb a lot of land, though, by trying to have fire breaks or whatever you call them. Would you get more weeds in those areas afterwards?
I've actually seen, dozer line does disturb the ground quite a bit. Invasive plants, I've seen Canadian thistle a few times, fireweed, kochia.
Yeah, the annual species.
Yeah.
Some of the work done at MSU with looking specifically at cheatgrass response to fire, because in other parts of the West, there's a positive relationship between fire and cheatgrass. So, like if you go to the Great Basin, so places further west and south of Montana, some of the work at MSU has indicated that the dozer lines, the fire lines, are really where the cheatgrass shows up the most. So if you have a healthy rangeland that's comprised of perennial grasses and forbs, and there's a little bit of cheatgrass there before the fire, we haven't seen that increase in cheatgrass. Where we see the increase is where we disturb the soil with the dozer line. And that's really where the post-fire weed management should probably focus on.
I'm sitting here thinking, I've got a question for you in a moment, but the Native Indians, the Native Americans here, often started their fires to, quote, improve the grasslands. Do these forest fires or range fires over time improve any of the rangeland?
I can talk a little bit about that from like a forage nutrition perspective, and then maybe Jane can talk about weeds and things like that. But historically there is some evidence and accounts where the Native Americans would burn vast expanses of rangelands and areas, and the thought process is that would in turn improve the quality of the forages there that following spring. So it was a way essentially to attract the bison herds to come back for hunting grounds and things like that. And in fact, what we have found is that when a wildfire goes through, that next year it does typically improve the nutritional quality of that forage, but in the sense that that fire has removed all the residual stemmy stuff that's a couple years old, the litter, the things that are typically, the nutrients have leached out. And that next spring, the only thing that you have left exposed is new growth, that leafy growth, and those tend to be the parts of the plant that are the most nutritious. And so from an aspect of over time, I don't think it's like a time thing. It's more of a initial response. So the next spring it's going to be good. The longer you wait to go in there, it's probably going to get back to what you would normally see.
Okay, thank you. Good information. Abby from Helena, interesting question here. They say that leafcutter bees have damaged their peony and lilacs for the last several years. Is there any way we can deter them? And also they want to know, are they a pollinator? And I believe they are, but go ahead.
Yeah, leaf-cutting bees are a pretty great pollinator. They're pretty important in our landscape, and usually their damage is just superficial on trees. It's aesthetic damage, trees, shrubs, peonies especially, roses, lilacs, but the damage won't really harm your landscape plants. It's not really going to affect them, and the positive for this pollinator, they're a really great pollinator, but they're also pretty important in the alfalfa seed production industry as well. So I would just say it's just aesthetic damage that I wouldn't be too worried about. Yeah, I would be intrigued to see. It's pretty cool to watch them cut those little notches out of leaves.
It is. They are a neat insect. From Hot Springs, this is an interesting question. Cory, this person would like to know, are there specific towns in Montana that are more threatened by fires caused by coal seams?
There is, actually, as the data shows from what we've collected already. Any given day, you could have a wind-driven wildland fire. Even prior to this, Jack, that video you showed me, that was a wind-driven fire. So as we get into that, eastern Montana is one dry, I call it the desert. Eastern Montana is the desert. Not this year, thank God. But most given years, the biggest threat I could see to any population, I know the northern Cheyenne definitely is, that fire almost burned right into lame deer.
Right.
It was right on the verge of burning into lame deer. So all the smaller towns, there's always a potential. I can't really say the risk is always there.
Talking to Scott, he said that he's noticed as temperatures have warmed and now approach 100 degrees quite commonly out in the eastern part of the state, he thinks that the coal seam fires are more responsible for grassland fires at higher temperatures. Have you noticed that?
Yeah, I actually have noticed that. It's the last few years, every year we seem to be getting more and more coal seam caused wildland fires, and the fires always seem to be more and more extreme. 8 years ago, 10 years ago, a bigger fire, was 100 acres. A small fire to us now is 1,000 acres, honestly.
Yeah.
It seems we keep getting these mega fires, is what you call them, is more frequent.
Yeah. It's scary. It really is, man. I've seen a few of those fires out there. And once they get started, they're pretty difficult to contain, especially on a windy, breezy day.
Look out.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. From Helena, and also from Bozeman, they welcome Sam. They'd like to get to know him better, and they would like to know the sort of resources that you offer as a beef extension specialist. It's a good question.
Yeah, that is a good question, actually. I should also preface before I answer this question that I just started in June, so I'm going to do my best to give you that information. So we're always available. I would say just about almost all the campus-based extension or extension even off campus are very friendly to just phone calls, emails, even just stopping in the office if we're not out on tours and giving talks. I think one of the best places to probably look is on the web. We have a bunch of stuff. We have monk guides, extension bulletins in general, beyond just beef cattle, just an extension in general. We actually have for beef cattle specific, have an extension beef cattle extension page. We have a Facebook page, a YouTube channel. Is there anything I'm forgetting here? Yeah, there's a lot of stuff out there that's available. I wish I had those addresses fresh in my mind to put those out there, but I believe the beef extension one might be animal and range /beef.montana.edu or something close to that. But if you get on the Montana State University website and put extension beef, I think it'll pop up pretty quickly.
Yeah, all right, thank you. Jane, I think I'll throw this one to you, and this is, I always like to throw, here, it's a curve, right? From Bozeman, this person would like to know if controlled burns are used for sagebrush management, and do you think we need to do sagebrush management?
Well, they certainly can be. You know, historically, when fires burned more naturally, that was a way to take those woody species out of the grassland system. And sagebrush is not a resprouter, generally speaking. Some of our shrubby species resprout after fire. Sagebrush typically does not do that. So prescribed fire or even wildfire will take the sagebrush out. Does it get used very much anymore in terms of prescribed fire? A little bit, but you know, as we've been talking here tonight, with warmer, drier conditions, you know, the use of prescribed fire is becoming more and more of a challenge.
I agree.
I don't know if Cory or Sam have anything to offer in terms of prescribed fire for sagebrush control.
We actually do some smaller prescribed fires locally in the county for ranchers and stuff. But you got to be careful with the word sagebrush fire is due to sage grouse habitat. It's a touchy subject.
Yeah.
I meant as a rancher, that opens up better grass. I've seen personally, but then again, you got to deal with the other aspect of it, of the sage grouse habitat.
Right. And as you mentioned, you know, trained personnel are good at these controlled fires, but if you don't have that training and the equipment, it can be kind of a scary endeavor.
Yeah, you for sure have got to have a little experience. I've seen a handful of wildland fires prescribed turn out to be uncontrolled wildland fires. So yeah, definitely training is there.
Yeah, and I was just to add to that, I mean, I have seen some prescribed fire, not necessarily for sagebrush, but for other conifer encroaching into, I mean, that's more of a grassland-wide issue. So you see conifer encroachment into the Great Plains becoming an issue. You see it definitely in the Great Basin, but that gets a little tricky with the cheatgrass and whatnot. So you see a lot more mechanical removal, but I have seen where if it's a light conifers are just starting to kind of come in there, I've seen them use some prescribed fire to help keep them from establishing. But like I said, it's risky. There's a big risk that most people don't want to take when it comes to that.
Yes, I've been in the Midwest a little bit where the junipers have started to encroach, and I have actually seen fires get away back there. You never know when the wind's going to blow in the Midwest, and that's true out in your country too. It can get breezy out there on occasion. Change tunes a little bit. This person is pretty optimistic in that they want to grow cherries here in Montana, and again, maybe with climate change that's possible. So they've planted a bunch of cherries in their yard, and they would like Abby to tell them how to make them survive the first couple winters.
Yeah, this
No
is
pressure.
pretty challenging. But I mean, we do grow cherries in the western part of Montana, and they're amazing. But young trees, like cherry trees, especially when you're newly establishing them, they're pretty sensitive and can. It's a pretty important critical period for the first couple of years. So for their first winter, what I would recommend is if your ground isn't frozen yet, make sure you water these trees well in the fall so they have those moisture reserves. Add mulch to that soil line so you have, that root zone so that you have that nice buffer for those young roots as they're continuing to develop and establish. And for thin bark trees like cherries and plums, things like that, especially dark thin bark trees, wrapping the trunk is pretty important if you have like south or southwest exposure, because we can have sun scald where the bark will split and that can harm the health of the tree. So for the first couple of years in the winter, I'd recommend wrapping or using indoor latex paint around the trunk just to protect those trees.
While we're on the subject of trees, driving in this evening, here on campus, I have seen a lot of down branches and actually some trunks that have actually split. Suggestions on what growers, homeowners need to do about that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and especially because we haven't had, a lot of our trees hadn't gone dormant, and we had a snowfall here in Bozeman today. A lot of those trees that still have leaves on their branches, the snow that piles on adds a lot of extra stress to those branches and results in them breaking down or structural failures for those. So if you have these trees in your backyard with a lot of leaves still on them, I would recommend shaking those branches and getting rid of some of that snow. Use a broomstick and kind of shake it off to protect those trees so it doesn't damage their branches.
And the broken branches, get a chainsaw out, clean cuts.
Yeah, make sure you cut that cleanly, and the winter is a great time to do that.
Yeah. Okay.
Could I ask a follow-up of Abby?
Sure.
Did you say that you can use indoor latex paint
You can use,
on the, okay, to
latex paint.
paint the bark
Yeah.
so they don't like sun scald, even in the wintertime?
Yeah, so
Okay.
50% latex paint, 50% water, and then you just paint the trees, the trunk and the base of the
Okay.
tree for that. Yeah.
Or you can also use tree wrap.
Tree wraps as well. Yeah.
But painting's easier
Yeah, it's
and messier.
And you probably have some leftover
lying
paint
around.
somewhere in your house.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, enough with the paintbrush. All right. Cory from Helena, this caller would like a reminder about how the coal seam fires initially ignite. We touched on that a little bit. You want to touch on it a little bit more?
Yeah, Jack. So spontaneous combustion actually can cause them to ignite. Lightning could cause them to ignite, and also wildland fires. Wildland fires seems to be the most prominent cause. A lightning-caused wildland fire burns through and essentially catches all these pockets, veins of coal, exposed coal veins, and lights them up. So that is the prominent cause
And they're increasing, so no doubt about it.
every year.
And Cory, once they're burning, do they have to be above ground to burn, or, I mean, how do they get oxygen if the coal is below ground?
There's always a vent on every
Okay.
coal seam, so when they start burning under the ground, there's always an exit for it at the end of the seam, wherever it might be. We've found a vent from a burning coal seam, a couple hundred yards away.
Okay.
That's pretty amazing. We had a question here that came from Broadus, and this person says there's a company out there called TM Thermal. You want to? I think they're associated with coal seams.
Yeah, so CM Thermal, ironically, these guys is all started actually in November of last year when we started working on this, brought this as a stakeholder meeting. We had state, federal, local, everyone come to the table, and we were like, what are we going to do? We got to come up with a plan. And these two guys out of Powder River County, Quint Peterson and Miles Gardner, went ahead and started a drone business and thought that maybe using drones to find these hotspots would work, and it's proven very well. These guys are a wealth of knowledge on coal seams. I actually could say they're more experts than I am. We all work together all the time on this coal seam project. Those guys are good.
And they're mapping it, making it available to producers, ranchers.
So yes, there's a clause right now. We're collecting all this data, but long term, we're going to publish a map.
Okay.
So AML, DEQ, AML built the GIS platform for this for free, which was, it was field maps, if you guys use field maps. And then we'll take the drones, CM Thermal, fly, and then actually get the lat long picture, and some of them we walk into just because we want to see them.
And the map will be a map of the coal seam or the fire associated with a seam?
It'll be the burning coal seam, because as we're learning to figure out, there's so many problems with these burning coal seams. One, if they're on public land, somebody that's out, for example, right now hunting, goes and steps on them, you could actually fall into them. If you read the article, John Bailey actually out of Rosebud County fell through one in a pickup.
Wow.
And on a wildland fire, and you fall into one of those, you might consume your body. They're so hot.
Wow.
Yeah, dangerous. From Custer, Sam, this person would like to know, following a wildfire, he's been told that the recovering grasses are more nutritious than they were before the fire. Any truth to that?
Yeah, there is, and that kind of goes back to what we discussed a little bit. So that fire is going to go through and it's going to burn all the old brown standing stuff, which is high in fiber and kind of low in crude protein. And so in terms of like a grazing forage, it's not that the cattle can't utilize it, it's just not the most nutritious. And in an instance where there is no fire, a lot of that is left as standing litter or something, and then the next year the plant's growing through that. The cattle inherently eat some of that dead stuff as they're eating the good stuff, and at the end of the day, when that fire goes through, it gets rid of all of that. And so you just end up with that year's fresh leafy material growth, which is the most nutritious component. So as a rangeland on a whole, it does increase the overall nutrition for that year, maybe perhaps into the next year. But then after a few years, that litter then comes, gains back, and you're probably right back to what you were prior.
Okay, as a follow-up question, this comes from Bozeman. They would like to know, do ranchers ever fertilize rangeland?
I remember back when I was doing my undergrad and maybe even into my master's, there was a proposal of kind of doing that. But what I think they've found, for the most part on rangelands, the most limiting nutrient is really water. And so, and the cost-benefit ratio, I believe, and maybe you remember some of this work too, but I don't think it paid very well. I think you spent more money than what you got out of it, and you may be able to put some nitrogen down or something, but if you don't get the moisture, then it's just, it'll eventually leach out and not provide. So they did do some work. I just don't think it paid very well, if I remember right.
Yeah, on that note, let me throw this out there and you guys can jump in. Yeah, if you had to put a dollar figure on an acre of grass for a rancher, give me a number.
I like that.
Anybody want to, throw something out there? I love it when I stump the panel.
Well, what's the cost of an AUM? Do you know, Sam?
Yeah,
that would be one way to think about it. Like lease rates for an AUM, or.
Yeah, that would be actually a good question for like Kate Fuller.
Yeah, I was gonna say, where's our
I know she does some
economist?
lease work. But I can tell you, you definitely stumped me. But but what I will say out there is it's going to completely depend. Not all rangeland is equal. Some rangelands I've done work on in Montana have maybe 2,000 to 3,000 pounds per acre, and then I've been in places that are lucky to get 500 to 700 pounds per acre. And then the species composition associated with those, the quality is different, the fiber is different, the nutrition is different. So I don't think there's a solid number. It kind of depends where you're at. And
so it's an unfair question I posed.
Yes, yeah. It's a great question for Kate. I know she does some work in that.
Yeah.
Okay, sounds good. Abby, and this person from Bridger Canyon, just up the road here, they had a significant fire there 2 or 3 years ago. A big one. It did a lot of damage. And that wasn't a coal seam fire. But Abby, would you recommend shrubs as a live snow fence for a house in Bridger Canyon? It's a good question.
Yeah, that is a good question. If you have if you have the space for them, a few shrubs could work pretty well. It would depend on just the type of soil, the exposure that you have, and just the area. But people do use shrubs as live fences, as wind shelter and snow shelter pretty often. We have some publications on, I believe we have a Mont guide on shelter belts that have recommendations on types of vegetation that you can incorporate that work really well for that purpose. So I would check that out.
Question from Glendive for Cory. In mapping these coal seam fires, are you able to tell which ones are more dangerous to start a rangeland fire compared to others? It's a very legitimate question.
That is a very good question. So there are some, yes, based on the fuel type around it, honestly. That's what it comes down to. But once again, they're all very volatile. You never know any given day which one's going to start a wildland fire. There's been no mathematical arithmetic or anything to figure out which ones are more prone to start wildland fires.
Are some of them a lot bigger than others?
Oh yeah, there's some the size of this table here, or there's some that 300-400 acres big. Just monsters.
In years past, and just reading a little bit about this, wasn't the Bureau of Land or Mines responsible for the coal seam fires out in that area?
So, good question.
You don't want to go there.
Well, I'll go there to the best of my ability.
Okay.
So I believe that once upon a time, DOI, Department of Interior, did have a program that actually studied coal seam fires and had a program to put them out. And that was actually out of North Dakota where they done it. Roosevelt Park, I believe it is.
Yep.
Yeah. They actually had quite a few in there. But apparently, or they ran out of funding, is from the source I heard, ran out of funding, and so they shut that program down. But I know that they had actually had a mitigation strategy for these coal seams in North Dakota at the time.
So, a lot of people don't know eastern Montana very well. But what areas in eastern Montana, northern Wyoming, or the Theodore Roosevelt Park area, which area has the most coal seam fires?
So, from the data we've collected so far, it's pretty even. Eastern Montana is a checkerboard. There's state, BLM, private, BIA. Everyone's affected equally, I would say at this time. Everyone has them. Where they originally originated from is a different question. They're everywhere.
Okay. All right. Sam, from Custer again, this person would like to know if there's any MSU or USDA research going on the recovery of grasslands damaged by rainfires.
Yeah, that's a great question, and gosh, the years escape me a little bit. I know we discussed it. You probably remember the years, but a few years ago there was that really big fire. I think it was up by Jordan, Sydney area, burned a huge amount of the state. And actually, I do know that Dr. Clayton Marlowe and Dr. Lance Vermeer, Clayton Marlowe from Montana State, Lance Vermeer from ARS Miles City, had a graduate student that was looking at grazing and recovery post-fire. And then, I don't know if you'd say luck would have it or it's just making the best out of a unfortunate situation, but here more locally in Bozeman a couple years ago, 2019 I believe, there was a wildfire on our university Red Bluff Research Ranch, and Dr. Lance Vermeer, Clayton Marlowe, Dr. Tim Del Curto, and myself were able to come together and actually put several paddocks out there where we're actually looking at timing of grazing post-wildfire and how that affects animal diet. And Dr. Marlowe and Lance Vermeer are looking at vegetation components to that. We're looking at diet quality in burned versus unburned, and then from spring grazing to fall grazing at different times periods post-fire. So there is some stuff going out that we're doing right now. I don't think any of those results are out yet, but we're just wrapping up those studies this year, so they should be coming pretty soon.
Okay, that's interesting. Over to Jane and Abby. You guys thought you were going to get by without having to answer this question, but I just remembered I was supposed to ask it because Mary sent it to me. They want to know what the most dangerous plant in your garden could be.
I think that's a difficult question. I think it would depend on what aspect you're approaching that with and how you're viewing something as a dangerous plant. I'd say if you're talking about pets that might be in your yards and gardens, like dogs or cats, plants like lilies, tulips, and narcissus bulbs, they can be pretty toxic if they're consumed by animals. So I would say from that perspective of dangerous, those would be pretty high on the list for garden plants.
Yeah, so the toxicity.
Yeah.
Yeah, another angle you could look at that is, are there garden plants that could escape and become invasive? And there are still quite a few species in the horticulture industry that are sometimes used in landscaping that can become invasive. And some states have these species on their noxious weed list, some states don't. A couple species that come to mind for me are, there's a couple ornamental spurge plants, cypress spurge and myrtle spurge, that I think you can buy at the nursery that they can become invasive, kind of like leafy spurge. Most Montanans are familiar with leafy spurge. There's a lot of species on the state noxious weed list that were brought here and planted as ornamentals, like the toad flaxes, yellow and Dalmatian. Dyer's woad was planted as an ornamental, and for its qualities as a dye plant. They get indigo dye from that plant. So it kind of depends what angle that question's coming from, but
Maybe I'll clarify that next time you guys are on. We'll be a little more specific.
Okay.
If you got cats, what's dangerous to cats, what's dangerous to dogs, so forth and so on.
Yeah.
I do know that lilies and dogs do not get along.
Yeah.
But anyway, enough of that. Caller from Hardin would like to know more info about proper tree wrapping, like Abby mentioned, and keeping the wrap on for how long?
Yeah, so that's a good question. You can purchase wraps like we were talking about. You can use latex paints, and you can wrap entire trees for really sensitive trees or shrubs. Like certain arborvitaes, they can be pretty sensitive, especially new ones, where if you're wrapping the entire tree in burlap, you're supposed to stake it so that burlap isn't gonna attached to the foliage. That'll protect it from wind and drying out as well. We do have a lot of information about this on the msuextension.org, and if you Google tree wraps, we have information about other options that you have. For leaving it on for wraps, it's pretty important to remove those in the spring because that can constrict the growth of the trees as they come out of dormancy and start expanding. So it's important to remove those, but you can put them on right now. As soon as those trees go dormant, you can put those wraps on.
Okay, thank you.
I'm really hung up on the paint thing. So in the spring, the paint is okay, or do you wash it off?
Yeah, I think it just degrades. So you'll see trees still in the landscape that have that white paint on them. You see them all the time. And sometimes if that really deteriorates, you can add a fresh coat, after a few years, but you might not have to paint it every year.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. From Glendive, this person is fascinated by mapping these coal seam fires. And they want to know, is this done mainly in the wintertime when the snow melts and you have the bare areas, or is there steam coming out of them? They want to know how these drones map.
Yeah, well, that actually is a very good question. Wintertime is for sure the most prominent time to map them. Like I said, I was out the other day, it was still 50 degrees, maybe 60, and there was smoke rolling out of the ground, smoke and steam.
Yeah.
But wintertime, the ground, like last winter we went out, there was a foot of snow on the ground. It was 20 below, and there's just this barren spot on the ground, and steam rolling out of it. And you go over there and you get kind of close. I like to flirt with danger a little bit sometimes, but the ground's mud. I meant close to it. How much heat is underneath that ground? It's pretty impressive. I mean, this was January and it was froze all winter, and then it's mud.
Yeah, amazing. Question for Sam. Is there any precision ag techniques that you're aware of that might be useful in managing wildlife, wildfire interactions?
Yeah, so the College of Ag at Montana State is actually a big proponent of precision ag technologies, and we've been working in a multi-state group actually looking at precision ag, livestock technologies, in production systems. And one of our multi-state collaborators at Oregon State has actually been doing a lot of work with the virtual fence. And so some of the things that they've been doing and doing quite successfully and publishing is looking at using virtual fence to potentially, I think one of their studies they looked at, they put a fire line in there and tried to keep the livestock out of the burn area using virtual fence technology, which we haven't talked about, but these fires also burn up fences and cause a big issue there for grazing. And so this would be a potential to graze those areas and not graze the more sensitive fire areas. And then the other thing they've done that I believe they just got published and are working on is using livestock to create natural fire breaks. And so putting these collars on the animal, designating where they would like the fire break to be, and then using those animals to reduce the vegetation in those areas in a hope to, if there is a fire, that slows it down enough to get it out or cause a fire break there. So a lot of interesting work coming out of Oregon State right now.
Okay.
I do have a follow-up question for you. Since we couldn't figure out a price of an acre variance, what's a mile of fence cost these days?
Oh shoot! I just saw some interesting data on this, and it was presented by the Oregon State folks, and I don't remember the exact number, but when you see the virtual fence numbers come out, one of the big red flags is just the cost. They usually rent these collars out, but you have to purchase a tower to communicate to the collar, or for the collar to communicate to the satellite. And that number, I know, I want to say that number for that was somewhere in that $20,000 range. And that made me, I was a little shocked by that. But then they put out what the cost for a mile of fence is right now, and it exceeded drastically what it would cost to put some of this virtual fence technology on the landscape.
I had heard like maybe 5,000 to 8,000 for a mile of fence, but you're looking at me surprised, like more than that?
A mile of steel fence is anywhere between $20,000 and $30,000 right now. That's
Wow.
Well, that's I know going right at home, but then topography plays a little role with it too.
Yeah. That was a few years ago when I heard that $5,000.
We're in different times now.
We are in different times, that's for sure.
Okay. Cory, this is one that just came in from Kalispell, and they've heard that people do attempt to put coal seam fires out. Can they plug the vents that provide oxygen? Can they pour enough gravel or dirt on them to put them out? Anybody tried some of these things?
So actually, they're in south of Miles City quite a ways. There's one that was done a long, long time ago. You could still see the reclamation work that was done to it. And they actually stuff a sniffer tube in the ground, so they pull a cap off and you can sniff to see if the coal's still burning. Crazy enough, but there has been attempts. I know of some that have failed, and I know that of some are still the unknown. It's testing the data right now. There's so many options to try, but cost reasonable is the priority.
No.
Cost effectiveness.
Yeah, take the McCrae Ranch. I don't know how big they are. Close to 100,000 acres, maybe 70,000.
They're a pretty big place.
Okay, yeah, it's huge.
Yep.
So how many coal seam fires might they have on their property?
I honestly can't give you an answer right now.
Okay, but almost all ranchers in that area have a fire or two that they have to contend with.
There's every year, yeah. That whole area, John Bailey, Jared Broadus, McCrae's, they're probably one of the Coffees. They're probably one of the worst areas affected, just based on from topography standpoint. The coal seam fires are in such rough area, and it's
not good.
It's not good.
And it's increasing.
It is increasing, and the Cheyenne Reservation just to the south, the Crow. I haven't actually went over to Bighorn County yet, but I know they got a bunch of them. Treasure County has a handful along the Little Wolf Mountains there.
Okay.
And trying to figure those ones too.
Amazing story. One for our weed scientist, invasive plant specialist. They want to know how long will leafy spurge seeds remain active in the soil?
That's a good
Oh
question.
man, that is a good question, and there
don't like
probably
leafy
is
spurge.
actually an answer. Someone's probably actually done that research. I think it's. I'm just going to put a guess out there, probably
That's
somewhere
good.
between 5 and 15 years. I think they're fairly long-lived seeds. But I think one of the bigger challenges with leafy spurge is the root system. So once you get an infestation established, it's persisting at that site because those roots are so extensive and they can go so deep. There's a root rollout that we use for educational purposes that was modeled after a plant that was actually found along a road cut, I think in western North Dakota, and those roots are like 15 feet deep. So that's what allows leafy spurge to persist. It's not so much the seeds in the seed bank.
Okay. We're getting down toward the end of the wire. I've got one quick question here, which comes in almost every year at this time. Is it too late to plant garlic?
If your ground is not frozen, you can still put garlic in the ground. So as long as your soil is still workable, you can put garlic in the ground here in Montana.
And with all this moisture and stuff, it'd be a good time
It'd be
to...
probably, yeah, great time to do it.
And we have had some good moisture finally. We come to the end of another program. I want to thank Sam, first of all, for his first time here. Cory, it's a pleasure to have you over. Very knowledgeable, very interesting. Good luck on fighting those things out there. The rest of the panel, thank you as always. Next week, we're going to look at forage and the need for volunteers in 4-H, and 4-H just has a new big grant that you'll learn all about. It'll be interesting. Meanwhile, have a good week, good night, and join us next week. Goodbye.
For more information and resources, visit montanapbs.org/aglive.
Montana Ag Live is made possible by the Montana Department of Agriculture, the MSU Extension Service, the MSU Ag Experiment Stations of the College of Agriculture, the Montana Wheat and Barley Committee, Cashman Nursery and Landscaping, the Northern Pulse Growers Association, and the Gallatin Gardeners Club. Programming on Montana PBS is made possible in part by viewers like you, and by the Montana Nursery and Landscape Association, a trade association of horticulture professionals who can assist with yard, gardening, and outdoor space questions. Members in your area can be found at plantingmontana.com.